the mother-in-law's plot, a plan to eliminate. Claire would never forget the look of disdain in her mother-in-law's eyes the first time they met. Margaret, a woman of power and elegance, always maintained a facade of polite civility, but her cold eyes could never hide her contempt. From that first glance, Claire knew that in Margaret's eyes, she would never be good enough for this prestigious family. Yet, Claire had told herself that as long as she loved Daniel with all her heart and tried to fit in, Margaret would eventually accept her. But she was wrong. The spacious kitchen, with its gleaming marble floors, suddenly felt cold as Margaret walked in, her designer heels clicking with arrogant precision on the polished floor. While Claire was clearing the dishes from the family lunch, Margaret approached quietly, her scarlet lips curling into a disingenuous smile. "Dear Claire," Margaret's voice was deceptively sweet. "Don't drag this out any longer. It's time for you to leave." Claire felt her hands freeze. The silver fork she was holding suddenly felt unbearably heavy. She turned around, eyes wide with shock. "What do you mean?" Her voice trembled as she tried to suppress her emotions, but Margaret's gaze remained icy, devoid of any empathy or hesitation. "You don't belong in this family. You're not good enough for Daniel," Margaret stated bluntly, without bothering to mask her intentions. Her words were as sharp as a knife, cutting deep into Claire's pride. Claire knew she wasn't perfect, but she never imagined she needed to be perfect, by Margaret's standards. She had tried her best to please her. She attended every charity event, patiently listened to Margaret's boring socialite stories, and even learned how to dress and carry herself with sophistication. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, in her mother-in-law's eyes, she would always be unworthy. "You don't come from a distinguished family, you have no inheritance, and you offer no advantageous social connections for Daniel," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with contempt. "Someone like you would only weigh him down. Do you understand?" Claire stared into Margaret's cold eyes, feeling her world collapse. Those cruel words not only insulted her, but completely invalidated her worth as a human being. What hurt Claire the most was that while her mother-in-law was scheming to remove her from Daniel's life, Daniel remained completely unaware. From the living room, she could hear his cheerful laughter as he chatted with his father, blissfully ignorant of the heartbreak happening right in their kitchen. Claire wanted to run to him, to scream, and tell him that his mother was trying to destroy their marriage. But she knew that doing so would only make things worse. Margaret would deny everything, playing the innocent victim and painting Claire as the unreasonable, petty wife. Daniel loved his mother blindly, and Claire knew that if it came down to a choice, he would choose his mother over her without hesitation. That realization shattered her heart even more. She had sacrificed so much to be a part of this family. But in the end, she was still an outsider. Claire wanted to cry, to scream at the injustice she was enduring. But she had learned to control her emotions, to smile even when her heart was breaking. She swallowed her tears and forced herself to stay calm. She looked straight into Margaret's eyes, searching for any sign of kindness or remorse, but found only coldness and triumph. Margaret believed she had already won, that Claire would break under her pressure. But Claire refused to show weakness in front of this woman. She smiled, a smile Margaret would never understand. "I understand, Mother." Claire's voice was steady and firm, catching Margaret off guard. She placed the silver fork gently on the table, as if ending a trivial conversation. "Thank you for your honesty." Margaret was surprised by Claire's reaction. She hadn't expected her to be so calm. For a moment Margaret felt a flicker of unease, but she quickly dismissed it, convincing herself that Claire was merely pretending to be strong. She was confident that Claire wouldn't be able to withstand the pressure she was about to impose. What Margaret didn't realize was that Claire had stopped seeking her approval. Claire no longer needed this woman's validation to know her own worth. In that moment, Claire decided that she would no longer allow anyone to belittle her. Especially not Margaret. Claire turned away, leaving Margaret standing there, confused by her lack of resistance. Margaret thought Claire had surrendered, that the game was over. But in reality, it had just begun. And Margaret had no idea that she had just ignited a battle she could never win. Because Claire had made up her mind, Not only would she protect her marriage, but she would also defend her dignity and self-worth. And nothing is more dangerous than a woman who finds strength in her own pain. As Claire stepped out of the cold kitchen, where Margaret's venomous words still echoed in her mind, the afternoon sunlight streamed through the grand windows, illuminating the polished hardwood floors of the mansion Margaret was so proud of. The house she always boasted about as Daniel's inheritance, the pride of this prestigious family. Claire looked around, a mocking smile forming on her lips. Margaret had no idea. None of them did. This house, with its grand windows overlooking the sprawling garden, the lavishly decorated living room, and even the gleaming kitchen where Margaret had insulted her, it all belonged to Claire. Every brick, every plank of wood, every blade of grass in the garden, it was all bought with her money. Not Daniel's, not the wealth of Margaret's distinguished family. It was all hers. She had purchased this house with the first fortune she made from the company she built from the ground up. The company Margaret always looked down upon, mockingly calling it Claire's little shop. Margaret never truly knew that the little shop had grown into a multi-million-dollar online empire. Claire had deliberately kept this secret to avoid jealousy and gossip from people like Margaret, people who believed a woman's worth was determined by her lineage and family name. Margaret loved to taunt her. "Oh, how's that little shop of yours doing? I hope it keeps you busy." She never asked out of genuine interest. It was always a reminder that Claire was not good enough, that she didn't belong in this wealthy family. But Margaret never knew that the very little shop she scorned was what gave Claire everything. Freedom, financial independence, and above all, power. Claire had grown tired of trying to please a woman who would never respect her. Margaret never knew that Claire was the one paying the utility bills, the property taxes, and every living expense in the house she thought belonged to her son. Claire had put Daniel's name on all the contracts only to protect his pride, so he wouldn't feel inferior. But now, after he and his mother had chosen to betray her, Claire no longer had a reason to keep the truth hidden. Margaret had made one fatal mistake. She underestimated Claire. She saw Claire as a weak outsider who could be easily discarded. But Claire was the one holding all the power, the one who had quietly built an empire without relying on anyone. Margaret's arrogance and prejudice blinded her to Claire's true strength. The audience's support. If you were Claire, what would you do? Would you remain silent and let them believe they had won? Or would you show them they never had control over you? Claire doesn't need to seek revenge out of spite. All she needs to do is let the truth speak for itself. Let Margaret and Daniel realize that everything they take pride in never truly belonged to them. The sweetest revenge is the stark, undeniable truth. What do you think? Let Claire know that she's not alone in this battle. Claire deserves a fair ending, one filled with dignity and pride. 3. The intelligent revenge plot. Claire sat in her office, gazing through the large window at the city lights twinkling below. She took a sip of red wine, savoring the bitterness that danced on her tongue. Everything seemed peaceful, but deep inside, she knew the storm was just beginning to brew. Not from her, but from the sheer stupidity and arrogance of Margaret and Daniel. Claire didn't need to do anything. They were digging their own graves. Margaret thought she had won. She believed Claire would obediently leave, abandoning all the property to her son, the one she deemed the rightful owner of this luxurious house and lifestyle. But Margaret had overlooked one crucial fact. True power doesn't come from reputation or family lineage, it comes from ownership. And Claire was the sole owner of everything. Claire knew Margaret wouldn't stop until she achieved her goal. So, Claire decided to let Margaret believe she had won, allowing her to bask in the illusion of power and control. She responded to Margaret's messages with seemingly obedient words. "I understand. I will leave." Claire even packed her bags and temporarily moved into a luxurious hotel. A hotel Margaret would never have imagined Claire could afford. Margaret was certain Claire was miserable, desperate, and defeated. But Margaret was wrong. Claire wasn't running away. She was simply giving Margaret a false sense of security. Claire wanted her to believe her plan had worked, that Claire had fully surrendered. It was the only way to make Margaret lower her guard and destroy herself. And Margaret did just that. She boasted to her friends, proudly proclaiming that she had freed her son from an unworthy woman. She even began making plans to find a new daughter-in-law, someone with better pedigree, as if Daniel were a prince searching for his princess. Little did Margaret realize that while she was busy celebrating her victory, she was losing everything. Claire had meticulously prepared every detail. She quietly handed over the management of her company to a trusted CEO, freeing herself to fully engage in the play Margaret was directing. She consulted her lawyer, carefully reviewing every clause in the prenuptial agreement Daniel had signed without reading. Every asset, every investment, and even the house Margaret was living in belonged to Claire. When Daniel and his mother finally discovered that his name was on none of the property documents, Claire could already imagine their stunned faces. She could picture Margaret frantically calling her lawyer, demanding that this mistake be fixed, only to hear the brutal truth. There is no mistake. Everything is legally binding. Claire didn't need to personally exact revenge. The truth would do it for her. In America, where the law fiercely protects property ownership and prenuptial agreements are held in high regard, Margaret had no chance of reclaiming what she believed rightfully belonged to her son. Claire had anticipated every possible move, ensuring every document was legally airtight. She didn't break any laws. She simply played by the rules, but by her rules. Claire chose the most intelligent form of revenge, allowing her enemies to destroy themselves through their own arrogance. She didn't need to shout or fight, she just needed to smile and wait. Wait for the moment when Margaret and Daniel realized that everything they took pride in was never truly theirs. And when that moment came, Claire's victory would be sweeter than any revenge in the world. This wasn't just a battle for power or property. It was a fight for dignity and self-respect. Claire wasn't seeking revenge out of hatred, she needed to assert her worth. She wanted Margaret to understand that not all women could be trampled on so easily. She wanted Daniel to realize that blindly obeying his mother had cost him the only woman who truly loved him. Claire placed her wine glass on the table, her eyes gleaming with determination. It was time to drop the curtain. She stood up, her high heels clicking softly on the polished floor as she walked out of her office. The game had begun. But this time, Claire was the one writing the script. 4. The downfall of the betrayers. Claire had anticipated every reaction from Margaret and Daniel, but even so, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness when they finally occurred. Not for them, but for herself, for the love she once had for Daniel, for the respect she once tried to give Margaret, hoping she would one day accept her as a daughter. But all of that crumbled the moment they chose to betray her. The day after Daniel discovered his name wasn't on any of the property documents, he called Claire 17 times. Claire didn't answer a single call. She let him drown in confusion and fear, forcing him to face the truth on his own. In America, where property rights are protected by ironclad laws, Daniel understood that having no name on the deed meant having no claim to the house. And that was the first harsh reality he had to face. Margaret didn't stay quiet either. She stormed to Claire's house. No, Claire's house, not Daniel's. The house she had proudly shown off to friends, bragging about the perfect life her son had built there. Now she stood at the locked door, screaming like a madwoman. "Claire, open this door. You can't do this. This is Daniel's house." But she was wrong. Claire didn't need to open the door. Margaret had no rights there. No voice, no authority. Claire watched through the security camera as Margaret's face twisted with rage and helplessness. Then she walked away, leaving Margaret shouting at a closed door. Claire didn't need to respond to them. She knew the law was on her side, and her silence was the most powerful declaration of authority. The next day, Claire received a message from her lawyer. "Margaret is trying to sue for the house. Don't worry, she doesn't stand a chance." Claire replied with just one word: "Let her try." Margaret didn't give up easily. She publicly slandered Claire, telling friends and family that Claire was a gold digger who had tricked her son into signing an unfair prenuptial agreement. But in America, prenuptial agreements are legally binding if both parties sign willingly. Daniel had signed it without reading. That was his mistake, not Claire's. Daniel eventually showed up at Claire's office, looking disheveled and exhausted, dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights. "Claire, can we please talk? I didn't know it would come to this." Claire looked at him, her eyes devoid of any emotion. "I didn't know you even had feelings," she replied coldly. "I thought I was just a burden unworthy of your perfect life." Daniel tried to explain, to apologize, to beg. But Claire turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, confused and empty. Daniel lost everything. No house, no assets, no job, all because of his arrogance and blind loyalty to his mother. Margaret lost her reputation and social standing when people discovered that everything she boasted about was built on lies. And Claire? She not only kept all of her property, but also regained her dignity and independence. Claire's sweetest revenge wasn't watching them suffer. It was walking away with confidence and strength, leaving them behind to face the ruins they created. They had destroyed themselves. That was the most fitting punishment Claire could give them. 5. Claire's liberation and growth. Claire stood by the window in her office, looking out at the bustling cityscape. The very place where she built her career from nothing. For the first time in months, she felt truly free. She no longer had to pretend to be the perfect daughter-in-law. She no longer had to smile politely at cruel remarks. She had freed herself from their toxic control. When Daniel and Margaret finally realized that everything they took pride in never truly belonged to them, Claire knew she didn't need to seek revenge any further. The truth had avenged her. She once believed she needed their acceptance to validate her worth. But now, Claire understood that her value was never tied to their approval. She had found herself again, and nothing could break her anymore. A beautiful ending for all characters. Claire, liberation, and new beginnings. 1 year later, Claire stood on the grand stage of the annual business conference in New York, surrounded by thunderous applause from the audience. She had been named Businesswoman of the Year, a title she never imagined she could achieve while trapped in that stifling marriage. Claire looked out at the crowd, the shimmering lights reflecting off her confident face. This was her moment, not theirs. She had risen on her own, she had won on her own, and the most beautiful part was that she did it without revenge or bitterness. Claire chose to focus on herself, on her dreams and ambitions, instead of harboring hatred or resentment. She chose forgiveness, not for them, but for herself. Daniel, change and a second chance. Daniel stood at the back of the auditorium, wearing an old suit, his eyes red but glistening with pride. He had lost everything, but he had also learned everything. After losing his home, his job, and his mother's support, Daniel was forced to face himself, to confront his own poor choices and his dependence on Margaret. He had to start over, beginning with a sales job at a grocery store. He chose not to blame Claire, because he knew the mistakes were his own. He apologized to Claire, not to win her back, but to free himself from his guilt. And Claire forgave him, genuinely and calmly. They did not get back together, but they were able to smile when they met. Daniel learned to respect Claire, to honor her independence and success. He grew from his loss, and that was the most valuable thing he could have gained. Regret and a chance for family reunion. Margaret was no longer the powerful and arrogant woman she once was. She lost control, lost respect, and even lost her closeness with her own son. But Margaret also learned how to change. She realized that her manipulation and pride had led Daniel down the wrong path, destroying his marriage and her own happiness. Margaret approached Claire, not to reclaim anything, but to apologize. "I was wrong, I hurt you, and I can't change the past, but I want you to know, I truly regret it." Claire chose to forgive, because she didn't want to carry hatred in her heart. But she also chose to maintain her distance, because she knew that not every wound could be completely healed. Margaret started over, learning how to be a better mother and grandmother. She couldn't change the past, but she could do better in the present. Claire, freedom and new beginnings. After the ceremony, Claire stepped out onto Fifth Avenue, the vibrant neon lights reflecting off the luxurious windows. She felt light, free from pressure, free from burdens. She was no longer Daniel's wife or Margaret's daughter-in-law. She was Claire, a strong, independent, and successful woman. A tall, handsome man approached her with a warm smile. "Congratulations, Claire, you've accomplished something truly remarkable." It was James, an old friend who had quietly supported her throughout her difficult journey. They found each other amidst the ruins and loss, choosing to walk a new path together, not out of dependence, but because they respected and loved each other for who they truly were. Claire held James's hand, feeling warmth and peace. She no longer needed to prove herself. She no longer needed anyone's approval but her own. She had won, not by defeating others, but by overcoming herself. Claire's story doesn't end here. It is merely the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where she is free to choose her own path, a chapter where she gets to live as her true self. And that is the truest happiness of all.